Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Quack&Co, the channel where everything is under 10 minutes all the time, every time. And today we're doing another video on gaming terms and, well, gaming terms, I don't really have another way of putting it. Now, gaming terms, this is going to be covering different terms in the gaming space, different terminology, mechanics, things that are, well, terminology that you may or may not have heard of, because it's something I get a lot of requests for and haven't really taken the time to do, but I'm going to start now. Well, actually, I started a video ago. This is the second one of the series, but this time, today we're tackling drafting. Drafting as a game mechanic, and we're actually going to combine two separate concepts together because they're often associated. If you look at Board Game Geek has these listed out. I'm mostly going to be applying the way they separate and distinguish between the two terms, but let's explain what drafting is. There's drafting, there's card drafting, there's open drafting. They're all subsets of the idea of drafting. Drafting is the idea of selecting stuff in games. These games all have different elements of drafting. We'll explain how they're different in the ways they do things differently in a short while, but effectively drafting is the idea of selecting different stuff. The most common, or at least the most common to me, application of the generic term drafting is the idea of having a hand of cards, picking one, and passing them on. So for example, you're going to distribute, 5 cards, let's say, to each player. Then each player is going to pick up their hand of 5 cards, pick one, pass the rest of the 4, pass the other 4, then get the 4 from the ones on their other side, pick another one, and keep going. Rinse and repeat until you have a hand of 5 cards that you've drafted one at a time from a passing hand of cards, although that's not the only definition of what drafting is. First of all, it's not always cards. While it is most commonly cards, it could be anything. Anything you can hold, anything you could touch. If you're playing Draftosaurus, which is a little dinosaur game, you'll be drafting little hands of meeples. That's what you're going to be drafting. Hands of meeples, which is very different than what you used to. If you're playing Between Two Castles Mad King Ludwig, you're going to be drafting tiles, a little hand of tiles. Just physical, little cardboard tiles instead of cards. Same functionality applies. But then there's the term open drafting. Open drafting is a subset of drafting in which rather than drafting and selecting from a passing hand of whatever, you are instead doing it from a common center tableau. I don't know if tableau is the right term, a display. You're going to have a display of things in the center. Again, it could be tiles, it could be cards, it could be anything really. And then you're going to be taking those things, you're going to be drafting them, open drafting them from that available display, where anyone has access to. And there'll be different rules depending on the game system, depending how it's implemented, but that's the general idea. So that is the broader description and terminology of what drafting is. Some of my favorite games that do involve drafting in one form or another, and I'll go through the small variations you might see from a rule stance in these different systems, are, well, right here. These are not the only drafting games I have. It is my favorite game mechanic, by the way, specifically card drafting when you're going round and around. But these are not my only ones, but these are definitely a few of them. We have Bunny Kingdom. Bunny Kingdom, depending on the player count, you'll be given a variable hand of cards. So for example, if a 3-player game with the expansion, you're getting 15 cards per player. From there, you're drafting 2 at a time. You're going to be given a hand of cards, picking 2, passing the next on, rinse and repeat until you're down to that final single card, and you'll take that card into your hand. You'll start with 15, you will end with 15, you will draft 2 at a time until you have 1 left. That will slightly change depending on the player count, but that's the general idea of Bunny Kingdom. Fairly straightforward. We have Seven Wonders. Seven Wonders, which is one of the granddaddy of drafting games to a degree. Although really Magic the Gathering probably is. But anyways, Seven Wonders. Seven Wonders is going to have card drafting as well. You're going to be given a hand of 7 cards in the base game. It can change depending on leaders and cities and all these other things. But the basic core concept is you get 7 cards. You're going to pick from those cards one at a time until you're down to the last 2 that you're handed. So you're going to have 5 in front of you that you've slowly selected. You'll have 2 left that you were handed by the last person. You will pick 1 and you will discard that final card. That is a common mechanic in drafting games where you don't necessarily keep all the stuff you drafted, but rather you might get rid of some. So for example, Isle of Cats, which I don't have on the table in front of me, has you drafting a bunch of cards, but then what you draft, you still have to pay to buy. So draft them can deny it from others, and that's a common thing in drafting, by the way, the idea of denial, the idea of not just focusing on what you want, but understanding that if you pass it to the next person, you're giving them something they might want. And so denial is a big part of drafting. But going back to Isle of Cats, you'll draft what you can potentially buy, but you then still have to buy and pay for those cards. Then we have Between Two Castles. The reason this one's here is because of the variation of the fact that it's not cards. From all the games on the table, this is the only one that is not cards. Drafting where you're not taking cards is less common, at least in my collection. It's less common in general, and it's very much less common in my collection. But in Between Two Castles Mad King Ludwig, you'll be drafting tiles, and then it actually has another interesting aspect to the game in which you're building things together with the players. So it has this aspect of, I can be drafting something, knowing that it'll be going to someone who's going to be utilizing it to our mutual advantage. So there's that other interesting element to the gameplay and strategy. We have Terraforming Mars. No real innovation here in the drafting mechanic past the fact that it's optional. Terraforming Mars is going to have players drawing 4 cards a turn and utilizing those cards. There's a drafting mechanic where you draw 4 cards and draft the cards as you go, and it is by far the only way that I will even consider playing this game. It adds so much strategy and nuance and just fun. I love drafting as a mechanic. It adds a degree of tension and frustration of knowing I want these things, I can't have them all, but I can pass them on to you. How are we going to manage and balance that? Then we have Everdell. Everdell is going to be a good example of open drafting. The idea that you have a center display with 8 cards in the meadow, and you can be taking cards from the meadow as various actions. It's not going to be turn structured. It's not like you're going around taking 1 card at a time from the meadow. Some games will have that idea, but in Everdell, it's just simply the cards are there, and you can deal with open drafting through the use of other actions. You can take other actions that will be utilized in order to take a card from the meadow. So it has the concept of open drafting. Like I said, if you say drafting to someone without further explanation, some people will apply it to all gaming terms, others will apply it specifically to the mechanism of passing cards around and around. And so that's the aspect of Everdell. And then lastly, we have Inish. Inish is something a little bit different than some other games, and this is why it's on the table over here. What it has is the idea of taking cards and potentially keeping multiple cards and passing more on. What does that mean? You're going to start with 4 cards in Inish in every round. You're going to pick a card, put it down in front of you, pass the other 3 on. You'll then be handed 3 cards from somebody else, and if I want, I can actually keep 2 cards from this new hand and then put the other card back and pass it on, meaning the idea that you each round you're going to have 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 cards, that much is true. But it allows you to swap a card you've already picked in order to get 2 cards from a different hand. That's something that most drafting mechanics do not actually do. It's something that Inish does a bit different, which is the point of having multiple games. I like showing and illustrating slight variations on how a game concept is being applied to any single engine. And that's drafting. My favorite game mechanic, specifically when you're passing hand to hand, one thing I didn't talk about is very often in drafting, a very common thing, is the idea that round to round, the drafting order switches. The reason for that, the reason that's a very common thing is because of the fact that otherwise you might be victim to if 2 players are pursuing the same strategy. Let's say I'm pursuing the same strategy as Jane over here. Well, if Jane's passing cards to me the entire game and it never switches back the other way, then Jane will always have first access to the cards that serve the strategy we're both going for. That won't be fair to me, which is why most games will have alternate drafting back and forth, and even those that don't, I'll usually house rule it in because of that concept, because I don't want a player to be penalized for being to the left or the second in drafting order from a player who is going for the same strategy. That's drafting, open drafting, card drafting, all those mechanics. I hope you find this series helpful. If you have any gaming terms or requests, anything you want to see covered in this video series, let me know in the comments down below and I will try to cover it. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Quack&Co, and have a good one.